Welcome to Perspectives, a podcast where the clergy women of the First United Methodist Church of San Diego share their musings on scripture, theology, and what it has to do with us.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspectives. I'm Reverend Brittany, and this week I am here with a special guest. Our Director of Communications, Meghan Claussen, is here with us as we continue on our Christ-like journey, and this week we're discussing that Jesus was misunderstood. We're going to be reading from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 15, verses 1 through 5, and we'll be reading from the Common English Translation. The story goes as follows. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Jesus was misunderstood. Jesus was misunderstood. Before we tap into our perspective, I just kind of want to explain what's going on in the text here. We're in the part of the Gospel of Mark where Jesus has been handed over to the chief priests and the scribes based on, this idea that he has broken the law. And so the chief priests and the scribes, they want to take him away and they hand him over to Pilate for this type of punishment, right? And so Jesus has already talked to the disciples in chapter 14 that, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to die. The disciples are like, absolutely not, especially Peter. Peter can't even hold on to himself. He's like, no, you're not going to die. And Jesus is like, yeah, I am. And you're going to deny me. And Peter's like, absolutely, I won't. Right. Peter absolutely did. And so when we get to chapter 15, Jesus has already accepted this fate that he has. He already knows that, his time is coming to an end. He knows that he is being put forth to death. And so when he gets to this meeting with the chief scribes and the elders and Pilate, he's just giving them answers that look and feel to Pilate a little bit like, you're not going to defend yourself. Like, why would you not defend yourself? Do you not know what this means? And Jesus gives really no reply. So, Meghan.
Yes.
We know, after having read and being immersed in the Gospels, that Jesus comes to give this new idea of what God is telling us to do and how to live in community with one another, how to care for those who are on the margins. Jesus didn't use the word margins, but to care for the least of these, how to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, and how to love God with our whole heart in so doing that. But his message wasn't always well received.
Right.
You're the director of communications.
Yes.
You are our chief priest in many ways, our chief scribe in many ways about effectively communicating our message. And so what does that, how does this scripture relate to you and some of the work that you do?
Absolutely. So, like you said, director of communications. I'm charged with our digital evangelism for the church. So it's taking all the great wisdom from you and Reverend Hannah and Reverend Trudy and making sure that we're able to amplify that out into the digital world. We know that's where so many people spend a majority of their time these days. Yeah. And a lot of people that really aren't comfortable in a traditional church environment, but still are interested in growing their faith. Now, obviously, as everyone knows, there's so many different flavors of Christianity. There's so many ways to interpret Scripture. Right. And really, we, as modern Christians, have lost that art of Scripture. Yeah. And so it's been really eye-opening and interesting for me as I stepped into this role and I started putting out, clips from the podcast, clips from our sermons, ways that we go out as disciples in our neighborhoods. The pushback, really, that we see from people that also identify as Christian, but interpret Scripture in a very different way. It's 2025, and I've been amazed how many people, when they see any clips from our 3 female pastors, they automatically will quote scripture as to, you certainly are not a Christian church because you have females that are in the pulpit.
Right.
And it's just amazing to me, like, how we can look at the same text.
Right.
And we can look at the Gospels, the same Gospels, and interpret such different ways.
So differently.
And people, you know, they put out there, like, this is satanic. You need to stay away from this church. They're not biblical. So, and for me, at first, it was extremely difficult not to respond to all those comments.
I was just going to say that. I was going to say, how do you deal with that?
It's so difficult at times. But most of the time you can tell, you can discern if someone actually wants to engage and learn about our viewpoints.
Right.
Versus if they just, you know, maybe they're having a bad day or, you know, they think that that's how they're going to win people over for Christ.
Right.
So a lot of the comments, honestly, we hide or delete if we feel like they're going to be harmful for others to see. We certainly don't want people that identify with different marginalized communities to see that and think, okay, that's what I've heard about churches, and they still don't accept females. They still don't accept queer community, you know. So those usually I delete. Every once in a while, though, I can see that the door has been open, and I can at least explain a little bit where we're coming from.
Yeah.
And the United Methodist theological viewpoint. I certainly don't think that maybe the commenter is going to change their opinions, but it may reach out to someone else that's reading the comments.
Yeah. I thank you for saying that, because I also find myself, I really don't read comments as much because I find myself unlike Jesus and very ready to defend myself and very ready to defend the church and very ready to defend the scriptures and the gospel and the teachings that I know of Jesus Christ. That's just my natural nature, you know? And so, like, there have definitely been moments when I've seen, like, a comment on Facebook or something, and I'm like, I'm not going to say anything because Megan's going to handle it much more eloquently than I would anyway. But it is hard to believe something so truly, right? On either side, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I hate that term, but truly, you know, these folks think that they're right, and maybe they feel that their words are being misunderstood. I don't know. What I do know is it's very difficult, no matter which side you stand on, to feel like you're being misunderstood, right? And Jesus honestly kind of prepares himself, I think, as he prepares the disciples before, you know, he gets to this execution story, that he tells them, like, you're going to go into the city and there are going to be people who don't receive your message. There are going to be people who don't want to hear what you have to say. Don't argue with them. Don't get yourself worked up. Just kick the dust off your shoes and keep it moving. And I've always appreciated that perspective because that's not my natural inclination. I want to argue you down to the ground about why I'm correct, right?
Yeah.
Or why you have taken what I've said and misinterpreted it. But that most of the time, coming into it with that combative spirit doesn't get us anywhere, right? And so that's what you're saying about, like, the argumentative piece.
Right.
Like, if the door is open and we can have a conversation, then great. But the need to defend myself as though I'm standing before trial isn't helpful for the church either.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. I've also always appreciated that verse about kicking the dust off your feet because really that's Jesus giving us that permission that we don't need to just keep pounding into someone why they need to, you know, give their lives to God or, you know, why they need to come to church or why they need to do X, Y, or Z. There's a time and a place, and if someone's mind is closed, then it's not going to be effective, like you said. I will also say that it's good for me that I know that I represent the church. Because if it was, you know, sometimes on my personal social media accounts, I will mistakenly go into comments for news articles, and I get a bit hot, a bit riled up, and I find myself responding. But knowing that I represent the church, I wouldn't do that on our church social media. So it's really good for me to have those boundaries. I am not Jesus.
Girl, I am often glad that I represent the church, because if it were my first thought, it, again, probably wouldn't be the most productive, whether I'm right or whether I'm, it's just not going to get us very far.
Right.
If I'm digging my heels in the ground the same way that this person has dug their heels in the ground, it's counterproductive,
Right.
So in the scripture, I also find it very interesting that Pilate is so shocked that Jesus refuses to defend himself against these allegations, right? Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, he being Jesus, "You say so." Like, Jesus is standing before, like, his executioner, right? And he says, "You say so." I mean, right. that's a confidence in being misunderstood that I don't know if I would have had, or if I do have, right. I'm standing before the person who has the power to kill me, and I respond with, "Well, you say so," right? Just right. Very, okay. And then it goes on that the priest accused him of many things, and then Pilate asks him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you. Like, do you not know what's going to happen to you? Like, you have nothing to say for yourself?" And Jesus honestly, took the anything you say can and will be used against you, you know what I mean? Right. In the court of law, well before that was established, right. Well before the Miranda rights were established. Jesus is like, I really have no reply. And I wonder where that kind of comes from for him. And I think about him growing up as a child of a teen mom who kind of came into the world under conditions that were not necessarily heard of before, right? The conditions in which Jesus came into being. So he is a Jewish person living in occupied Roman territory, essentially. He's coming from a not a single mother, but he's coming from a teen mom who's his conception is a little mysterious for everybody who knows what's going on. I don't necessarily think that, Jesus he didn't have a high status in society, right? His father was a carpenter, and so was he. So I think that he understands a bit about the margins, and people who live on the margins are often sometimes misunderstood. So when I think about in today's society, for instance, when there is a racially charged issue in society, if there's like a police shooting, for instance, of an unarmed African-American person, and there are protests in the streets, oftentimes when the protest, there's, looting or some sort, there's this idea that these people are just animals and they're tearing up their community, but there's no connection to what has gone on for decades and centuries, right? To create that kind of cultural milieu of rage, of deep disappointment, of deep frustration. And so that story isn't always told, but the narrative that's told is that, these people destroy their communities. And so I think that folks who have lived on the margins, whether they be racially marginalized or marginalized because of their sexuality or their gender expression, or marginalized because of their socioeconomic status, there's something about living in a society where you are misunderstood and mislabeled.
Right. And stereotyped. And you get tired after explaining yourself again and again and again, and people's minds aren't changing. So at some point you just stop. If that's what you're going to say of me, fine. Now, I don't know if necessarily Jesus was doing that. When I read this, I do always read it as him having a very flippant tone, and I don't think he did, probably. That's how I would respond.
I feel like Jesus is at a point where it's, okay, I'm going to die. So I've explained to you, I've told you who I was. I've explained to you what I've come to do. I've told the priests and the scribes have asked me all kinds of questions, all kinds of times. I'm not going to, at some point in our lives, I think, as people, we have to get to a point where we are less concerned about explaining ourselves and more concerned with, did we do what we knew was right?
Exactly.
Did we live into our call? Did Jesus do everything that God had instructed him to do, the thing that God had laid on his heart to do? If Jesus had done that, and I think that's the same for us, then we can walk away knowing I will be misunderstood, but I know that God understands me.
Exactly.
I know that God and I have this understanding of each other, and I understand what God called me to do. And that, to me, is more significant, I think, and more gratifying, even in the end of life. I would assume, because I've seen death. I've seen people leave this place, and in their dying, the ones who have lived fully faithful lives, there's just a sense of peace there. Right. There's a sense of quiet calm, and they don't have any regrets, and they're not trying to explain themselves anymore. There's just a sense of, I did what I was supposed to do. I lived, I loved, and I gave it my all. And I didn't do it perfectly all the time, but I did my best.
Right.
And I think that's a message for us all,
Yeah, I agree. And so many times we see people that have been misunderstood and mislabeled, but they continue to live their authentic selves and truthfully, like how they felt called. And, during their lives, or during most of their lives maybe, unfortunately, people misunderstood them. But oftentimes, retroactively, people have that aha moment, and they see now, they understand what they were doing. Just like now, we have the luxury of knowing the full gospel and what happens after. And so oftentimes when we're reading through it, we're like, how could they not understand what Jesus was saying? It's so obvious. But it's because we've seen the full thing.
Right.
And so I think now, as a human, it's nice to know that does happen, so that I don't have to continue arguing and fighting, and I can just continue living, and hopefully at one time, whoever I'm having a conflict with now will understand later.
Yeah. I hope so, right?
We can hope,
We can hope.
Yeah.
I think about, Dr. King even. We can look now and say, oh, Dr. King did so much, and we honor him, but he was not, he was the most hated man in America at one point in time in the 1960s, the late 1960s. So that's not the story that we're told now, right? That's not the story that he lived then. So he may have been misunderstood, and sometimes I still think misinterpreted, at least today.
Right.
But he lived the fullness of his life in the call that he had, no matter how many people called him out of his name or how many water hoses were sprayed on him and so many others. They continued to press forward in their living as best as they could to do the thing that God had called them to do, know? I also think, as we talk about society, I think that the church has often misunderstood people, particularly our LGBTQAI plus siblings. I think that we have marginalized them and misunderstood them and mislabeled them. And so now, as churches that are becoming more progressive in their theology, like our congregation, I think we have a little bit more explaining to do.
Right.
Because we have caused a lot of harm to folks. So in the way that Jesus says, if you say so, I don't think that the church can be that flippant.
Exactly. Yes.
We don't have the leg to stand on to say, well, if you say that that's who we are. No, we have kind of an obligation to make sure that we're correcting some of the narratives that have caused such grave harm to people, because if not, then our mission is lost. And I think that it's very important that not our individual expression is one thing, but our institutional and cultural expression is very different. And I think that we do need people to understand that we are different.
Right.
if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And that's been a large thing that I've been focusing on since I've come onto staff at the church. Because like I mentioned earlier, there's so many different flavors of Christianity these days. And I feel like the Methodist Church, while they do have a really great communications team, and there have been some larger global branding type of campaigns. The individual churches, the local churches, most of them don't have the staffing or the budget to be able to really amplify that message. And when I told coworkers at my previous place when I was coming here about this church and the mission and why I was so excited, you know, they have affordable housing initiative that they've been working on. They have a racial justice ministry. You know, they're fully welcoming of all people. These colleagues were all like, wow, I didn't know a church like that existed. Like, maybe I need to check it out. That's the type of church I would actually be willing to go to.
Right.
And so I've really been focused on trying to, you know, be loud about that to make sure people know that there are churches here in San Diego that are, you know, pursuing the justice, all kinds of divine justice, and really the specific things that we've been doing. In doing that, we have been starting to see a great mix of newcomers in the sanctuary.
Yes.
And sadly, we have heard from some of them that identify as queer that they were hesitant to come because they've tried other churches that have labeled themselves as open and welcoming.
Yeah.
But they weren't really.
And that's heartbreaking. That's heartbreaking because there's nothing more deflating than to get your hopes up about being seen and finally maybe being understood to only have that not be the case, you know?
Exactly.
I think that being misunderstood comes as a part of doing this kind of justice work. Yeah. Because in doing justice work, you are trying to right wrongs, right? You're trying to correct and course correct things that haven't always gone well. And that's what Jesus was trying to do, right? Like the commandments were there and people were living by them, but they weren't necessarily loving by them. Right. You know, they weren't really embracing them to share that love that God had given, that covenant that was made with other people, right? And so Jesus comes and wants to like interrupt that and to change that. And his message was misunderstood. And so I think that for all of us, when we are trying to live faithful lives, when we are trying to make sure that all of God's people are loved and seen and valued, where every person knows that their life matters, it will often be misunderstood. Yeah. Because we have been conditioned to hear things and see things in one very particular way. Right.
And I think that a lot of that is because we live in such a binary or duality type of world, right? Yeah. So we look at things as right and wrong, good or bad. Right. And that's not how it is. It's it's like a whole spectrum, right?
Absolutely.
And when people really cherish an institution or the practices, and maybe it's been like multi-generational, it's really hard to take a step back and look at it
objectively.
Thank you. You wouldn't know I'm a director of communications.
Oh, but I would.
Because there's just like so many emotions around it, right? They might even know that, you know, you're right, it's not quite right, right? But they don't want to release that control. Right. I really feel like today's society and all societies of all time, like power and control have been the greatest currency. Right. And part of that also is your reputation. So that's why people get so argumentative because that's really what's going to get them to whatever table where they're able to command that control.
Yeah. I mean, no one wants to be misunderstood. Like we're created to be in community. You want people to get along. You want people to know who you are. And so being misunderstood feels like a personal attack. And in many ways it can be. Right. And still, it's a part of the experience, I think, when you're trying to follow Christ, because he was misunderstood. And so I think that when we are thinking about who Jesus was, we also have to think about the things that Jesus went through. And it wasn't just, he was just divinely called by God and he walked a pleasant life. Like, he suffered. He had to make sacrifices. He was lonely. He was surrounded by people and often was like, what am I doing, Right. And so when we feel those things, I think instead of running from it, we should embrace it. And I know that's it's so cliche for me to even say, but to embrace the fact that we are close to Christ in making those sacrifices. I would also like to say, before we tie it up, because this has been a great discussion, this text has been taken out of context many times, and it has been used in anti-Semitic ways to say that the Jews killed Jesus, or the Jews were a part of this execution of Jesus. I would like to say, please, let's think a little bit more broadly and a little bit more expansively when we read these kinds of texts. Jesus was a Jewish person. The chief scribes and the priests were obviously also Jewish folks, but they were living in an occupied Roman Empire, right? And so the execution that came to Jesus was crucifixion, and that was imposed by the Roman government. And so I would like for us to take a moment and to pause when that anti-Semitism in our reading of the text, that anti-Semitism comes up, to remember that Jesus was in fact a Jew, right? And that his teachings were coming to expand God's teachings to everyone. And so let's be a little bit more thoughtful in our reflections of that, and a little bit more historically accurate when we're talking about his execution. Right. Jesus died because the empire that was the government in charge executed him. Right. Period. Hands down.
Yes. And even though Jesus was looking to expand the meaning of God's teachings in Judaism, right, he loved the religion. He practiced it.
Absolutely. He was. They found him at 12 years old in the synagogue. Like, he's a good Jewish boy. So let's not make him, I'm proud to be an American, and let's leave him in his Jewish context, please. And thank you.
You're welcome.
That's my little note. Thank you so much, Meghan Claussen, for joining me today. This is a really great conversation. I hope that you all have learned something new and got to know a little bit more about Meghan and some of the work that she does as our communications director. We have a couple of questions that we'd like for you to think about and spend some time reflecting on your own. You can talk with some folks in your family. If you would like to shoot us an email and let us know some of those thoughts, please feel free. Our first question is, what's a common misconception that people have about you? 2, if someone misunderstood something that you said or did, would you rather explain yourself or let it go? 3rd, how do you react when someone misjudges your intentions? That's how do you respond internally and externally even. And lastly, have you ever misunderstood someone else only to realize it later? We hope that you'll spend some time in reflection, and we also hope that you will join us next week for another episode of our Perspectives podcast. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
This is a production of First United Methodist Church of San Diego. To learn more about our events and ministries and to access additional learning resources, visit fumcsd.org.